on BMP as an organization. So we are a national project with a focus on, supporting communities and organizations and networks and movements to really address root causes of inequity and injustice. And for 25 years, we've been an organization that's been focused on developing insightful research, practical tools and resources to support organizational change efforts, and opportunities for deepening relationships to support organizations to work together in deeper alignment and solidarity with each other. We have a current survey that is live right now in the field where we're trying to gather data about how the current political climate is impacting nonprofit organizations. So you can take a picture of that QR code. The team from BMP will also drop the link to the survey that is currently live. So again, if you are in a leadership role in a nonprofit organization, it's a really important opportunity to provide to contribute to data collection effort around some of the challenges that organizations are facing in the current political climate. Okay, so then on the next slide, just a really quick review of the agenda before we pause and show some of the poll results. But we're going to start out with some conversation about the data that BMP has collected over 3 surveys on race and leadership in the sector. Then we're going to drill down into the latest findings from our report, the push and pull, that looks at why leadership aspiration is declining, what we see as negative forces that are pushing people of color towards leadership, and some of the dilemmas and challenges that leaders of color end up facing once they attain top leadership roles in the sector. And then we're going to move into a panel discussion to talk about what kind of supports can help to draw, pull, sustain leaders of color in the sector, and we'll wrap up with Q&A. So before digging into some of the report findings, just want to see if we can show some of the poll, the results of that first poll question, just to get a sense of who's in the room with us. So it looks like the majority or the biggest share of folks in the room are current leaders of color. Great to have you. Welcome. We also have a lot of aspiring leaders of color. So great to be able to have that 10% provide some support to you all and encouragement in terms of staying on the path towards becoming a organizational leader. Great also to have white leaders, current and aspiring, and then other capacity builders in the room with us. So on this next slide, going to start talking about our findings from the Race to Lead initiative over time. And so here on this next slide, you can see some of the big picture trends in terms of the Race to Lead initiative. So we have done surveys in 2016, 2019, and 2022, and combined that all of those surveys have garnered over 2,000 responses. So it's a very big data set when we look at the results over the 3 surveys. We are making no assertions about the survey being longitudinal. We acknowledge that the respondents have changed from survey to survey, but the actual composition of the survey in terms of some key demographics has been very similar. And there are findings from previous years of the survey that really resonate with our most recent data. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the demographics of the respondents to the survey on this next slide. You can see that we have roughly had a 60-40 split each of the years that we have done the survey, with around 60% of respondents to the survey being white, 40% of the respondents being people of color. And you can see the race breakdown in this figure as well. On the next slide, we can show the gender and sexuality of the respondents. And you can see that, overall, the majority of the sample identify as women. And then there has been increasing shares of the respondents who identify as non-binary, non-conforming, genderqueer, those other sorts of gender identities. And then with LGBTQ and straight, we have also seen an increase in the respondents identifying as LGBTQ IA+. On the next slide, we have the roles that people are reporting in the survey. And you can see that over time, the survey has become more weighted towards respondents who are in more senior roles, CEO, executive directors, senior managers, and directors. And, it's very possible that this reflects some of the shifts in the sector, and also, this some of the fact that the data of so much of our reporting has really emphasized the challenges, particularly facing leaders and leaders of color in the sector. On this next slide, we're looking at the impact of race on how people experience their own advancement in the nonprofit sector. And so the question fundamentally has been, do they feel like their race has had a negative impact on their advancement, or positive impact, or no impact? And you can see in 2016, a third of respondents of color reported that their race had a negative impact on their career advancement. But then in 2019, that increased to half, basically, and then it stayed at half in 2022. So clearly a shift in perception on the part of people of color about their career prospects and career advancement. And a similar change happened for white respondents. But for white respondents, it started at half of white respondents acknowledging essentially white racial privilege in their advancement, and then increasing to 2/3 of white respondents in 2019 and 2022. So just some of the ways in which the data helps to visualize and capture some of the significant shifts in perception and understanding of race in the nonprofit sector. On the next slide, we're looking at the particular gaps that people of color and white respondents are reporting based on the composition of the organizations that they're a part of. So the first row of data is for respondents who work for an organization that we categorized as a white run, based on the respondents reporting that 75% or more of the board or senior leaders of their organization were white. And so you can see for that first row, both in 2019 and in 2022, very noticeable gap between people of color and white respondents on the measure of whether they would be happy if they worked at the organization 3 years from now. Similar gap on whether people feel like they have a voice in those organizations, with people of color rating their organizations much less positively on a scale from 1 to 10 compared to their white peers in the same kinds of organizations. The gaps narrow for respondents who are working in organizations that are more diverse, but not quite as diverse as the last row, which is respondents who indicate that their organization has at least half of the board and senior leaders are people of color. And we categorize those as POC-led organizations. And you can see in that bottom row that there's effectively no gap between people of color and whites in terms of their experience of both of these measures. And the overall response, the overall ratings of organizations becomes more positive. And so part of why we wanted to start by laying some of that out is because we basically know from the data that respondents overall are happier in organizations that are more diverse, and that racial gaps between respondents are much more narrow in more diverse organizations as well. And so I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Frances to talk more about the findings from this particular report, the push and pull. Frances, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Great to be here. Thank you all for being on the webinar. This is our first report that really includes the 2022 data. And for those of us who know, those of you who know us, our first Race to Lead survey in 2016 really asked the question, why are there so few leaders of color in the nonprofit sector? And we are still asking that question 6-8 years later. And the findings of this report show that there's actually a decline to aspire to leadership. And I got to talk a little bit about that, especially for BIPOC respondents. The BIPOC respondents who are interested in leadership tend to be pushed into leadership by negative factors rather than pulled by positive factors on the difference they can make and the joy they might find in the job. And that the last thing is that maybe it's because BIPOC leaders still lag behind white leaders in the types of supports they receive once they're in the positions. So let's go to the first finding, which is that there's fewer people aspiring to be leaders in 2022 than in 2016 and 2019. So the people of color, that dark blue bar, are people who aspire to leadership. And I want to note that people of color still aspire to be leaders more than white leaders. In 2022, that was 14 percentage points more than white leadership. So people of color are still aspiring to be leaders more than their white counterparts. But you can see over time, for white people, there's a gradual decline in their interest in leadership, whereas for people of color, there was this little slight bump in 2019, not a huge difference, but then there's this pretty steep decline, a 6 percentage point decline when we get to 2022. Looking at it in a different way on the next slide, is people who say they definitely or probably do not want to lead a nonprofit. And between 2016 and 2019, there wasn't a really big change between people who said they didn't want to lead a nonprofit. But then you get to 2022 and you can see this kind of steep increase in the lack of interest in leading a nonprofit. So our question was, why is this happening? And the first thing is that why do people say they don't want to lead? And if you look at the next slide, this answer is from 2022, but it really reflects what we saw in 2016 and 2019. Usually people say, the work doesn't interest me. You can see that as the top reason for BIPOC respondents and the second top reason for white respondents, or that people are looking for more work-life balance. And that's especially true of white respondents. Also, people might say they're happier in their current job, that their skills aren't well suited. What's not on the slide is that people of color are more likely to say, though it's not a large percentage, that they're planning to leave the nonprofit sector. On the next slide, you can see where I want to just explain what you're going to see in the next few slides. We really started to dig into, okay, well, what makes somebody aspire to leadership? So we looked at the challenges that people said they faced currently in the sector, and we also looked at the supports they face. So I'm going to try to explain how to read these slides. You're going to see a few of them as I talk about these issues. So the little blue pin here, then like that little blue pinhead, is people who say they often or always face a challenge. In this case, it's inadequate salaries. And the little kind of orange or gold color pin is people who say they rarely or never faced a challenge. And these are people in each of those categories who aspire to leadership. So you can see here, especially for BIPOC respondents, if they experience inadequate salaries, they're more likely to aspire to leadership by 18 percentage points. It's really a high number. There's a slight difference between white respondents, but this challenge, instead of the want to retreat from leadership, it wants them to be leaders. That's the push into leadership in order to correct for themselves and for others challenges that they face. The next slide, you can see more of these challenges. The inadequate salaries is in the upper left here, but you also see too little attention devoted to staff wellness and care, the stress on being called upon to push diversity, equity, and inclusion in the organization, and few opportunities for advancement. So rather than being pulled to leadership by saying, oh, I don't have challenges, I want to experience, move ahead and experiences the impact and joy I can have in leading, you're being pulled to pushed to leadership by correcting negative experiences in the sector. So we thought maybe if people receive supports, they would be more likely to want to lead. And we find out slightly, if you go to the next slide, it gives you a sense of what you're going to see in the next, the slide after this, is that supports didn't really make that much of a difference. That the supports had a slight bump for people and receiving training, actually more for white respondents than for people of color respondents, but there's not this big difference that you saw in the challenges. And actually, if you look at mentors at my job, it's not even a positive effect for BIPOC respondents. It's a negative effect, much more of a positive effect for white respondents. The one place that seemed to make a difference, not a huge difference, but really did make a difference, was mentors outside the job. So maybe those mentors outside the job that people seek out members that help them with their advancement in the sector. So if we go to the next slide, we can look at why people might not want to, especially BIPOC leaders, might not want to BIPOC people aspiring to be leaders might not want to advance into leadership, because this slide shows the type of supports BIPOC leaders and white leaders face are given when they enter into a leadership position. So when you enter into a position, did you have support for the board? Well, look at this difference between right respondents, whether they had support from the board, and this is pretty consistent between the gaps are consistent or bigger between 2019 and 2022. So white respondents have more support from the board of directors and from the previous executive director. We added 2 new questions in 2022. BIPOC leaders also have less support from their staff and less support from other executive directors. The one place that BIPOC leaders transitioning into their jobs have more support is in executive coaching, and they also have a little bit more support in funding, which might be paying for that executive coaching. But that executive coaching might be to overcome some of the challenges that they face as they enter into their organizations. On the next slide, you can see the type of challenge that people face once they're in their positions. And again, you see that BIPOC leaders face more challenges for the staff supporting their leadership or accepting them, holding them accountable. And also not on this slide, there's more of support for white leaders from their board of directors, about a 10 percentage point difference. Again, most people get support from their board, but white leaders are more likely to be supported by their boards than BIPOC leaders. And then if you look at the next slide, we found when we asked people if they were in the process or thinking about leading the organization, the reason that they would leave. And we were really shocked by the dramatic response that especially BIPOC leaders, but both BIPOC and white leaders are leaving because of burnout. 41% of BIPOC leaders said that they're thinking about or planning to leave because they're burnt out. 31% of white leaders are much more likely to be leaving kind of almost an equal amount because they're retiring. And then some people say they want less responsibility. So what we asked next is what could be pulling people into leadership instead of pushing people into leadership from negative experience or by seeing the negative effects of BIPOC leaders, are there pulls into leadership? And we asked this question that you can see in the next slide just in 2022. And that question was, if you think about the difference about how you feel in these areas of work, how important these areas of work are before the pandemic, before the murder of George Floyd, before the uprisings, were these issues more important since that happened, or are they equally important? So since all those events of 2020, what is significantly more important to you and what is equally important? We also asked what's less important, but there were so few that were not showing that. And you could see here again, for people who aspire to be leaders, the mission of the organization is more important. The impact of the work they do is more important since 2020. The alignment between organizational practice and values, the impact of the organization, and the culture of the organization. And that gap between what's equally important and significantly more important is greater for BIPOC respondents than white respondents. So what would we recommend as we move forward? Well, first of all, we should make the job more doable. We have leadership jobs, especially for BIPOC leaders that are already coming in at a disadvantage, and we make it harder for them to succeed in their organizations. And that might be more funding, you need to hire more staff, but you also have to address the internal structures that are working against you, as well as the external environment that you're working in. We also need to be much more open to new forms of leadership. We found that between 2019 and 2022, more, especially BIPOC leaders, are co-leaders, that they're leading with somebody else. It went from 8 percentage points to 16 percentage points for BIPOC leaders. So what are the new ways that we can think about leadership and sharing leaderships that support people in these top roles? And then finally, you saw that slide where BIPOC leaders were receiving less support from exiting executive directors or existing executive directors. How can we resource cohorts or conversations between current and future leaders that really talk about the benefits and of leading, the supports people need, and the impact you can have when you become a leader of a nonprofit organization? So with that, Sean, can I turn it back over to you to introduce the panel?
Absolutely. We're excited to be joined today by our colleagues, Kavita, Khandekar, Chopra, Bamby Salcedo, and also by Kelly Woodland. We are going to drop their bios in the chat so you can get to know a little bit more about them. But we're going to actually start by shifting the view so that you can see all of us as panelists and we can start the conversation. And so what we're going to do is start by asking each of our panelists to respond to a question, sort of taking up this frame of like acknowledging that there are negative factors that are pushing a lot of leaders of color into leadership roles rather than positive factors that are pulling or drawing people into leadership. Want to pose a question to the three of you around what has pulled you towards being a nonprofit leader, or what has kept you in leadership as well, or sustained your leadership. Because, want to acknowledge that both things are probably true. There's been some ways in which you've probably been pushed, but also trying to think about like, what are some of the pulls and identifying some of those pulls. So let's see, Kavita, can we start with you and then we'll have Kelly go?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean. Hi, everybody. Kavita Khandekar Chopra, she, her pronouns, the Managing Director of Strategy and Engagement at Repower. And I love this question. And as I thought of the answer, I thought of my parents. I'm lucky to have really strong examples of community leadership in my life. And both my parents I view as leaders in their own right. My father being like in corporate America, my mom organizing her community, her people. And what I saw through them and what ultimately pulled me into leadership was really the joy that they received in building community, the pride in building something in collaboration with others, that joy that comes from seeing someone succeed and knowing you really had a hand in that. And because I'm a Virgo, I always say there's also just a real satisfaction of getting things done and having the access and the positional power to help get that done. So I really was reflecting on those pieces of seeing my own parents and their leadership over the years, and also thinking about watching my father, who took on additional leadership as his career progressed, and seeing how he was able to open the door for others as he stepped further and further up like a corporate ladder. I didn't end up in the corporate world. I ended up here in the nonprofit sector, but his strong sense of fairness and justice in his approach to leadership definitely left an imprint on me. And I think about that as a pull for myself as well, of what can I do in this with this positional power, with this leadership, to continue to wield it in a support of like the long arc of justice. So those are just some of the few polls that came to mind. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. Kelly, how about you? And then we'll hear from Bamby.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate it. Nice having the opportunity to meet everyone, see everyone through this platform. My name is Kelly Woodland. I am Managing Director of Leadership Equity for the United Way, Greater Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey. And similar to what Kavita mentioned, my parents had a very strong impact on me, and they always emphasized the responsibility to give and to help. But as I reflect on my career, I've had the opportunity to lead a couple nonprofits and a few initiatives. And honestly, Sean, when I looked at that question, I struggled to think of pull factors. So I can rattle off all the push, and in some cases, probably the shove factors all day long. But one of the things is, as I think about my current position, when I created the concept of leadership equity here at the United Way, in essence, not knowing about this research, my position is actually creating a positive conspiracy of pull factors for Black nonprofit leaders. And for me, a critical pull factor in what I'm doing currently is the United Way investing in me to invest and pour into Black leaders. Another pull factor is the latitude, the thought partnership and trust that's been extended to me to do what is needed. And one thing that I'd like to add is, as it relates to aspiring people to lead, people inherently have a need to be heard, valued, and recognized. And that's something that is common, especially among people of color. And in my opinion, is that in some cases in our society has conditioned us to believe that you have a better chance of being heard and recognized if you lead, if you represent an organization, or if you have some type of constituency behind you. So that may be another factor as we talk about how folks arrive or aspire to be leaders. I also think that the pull and push factors can be different based upon when in your career you have the opportunity to lead. But we'll talk a little bit more, but thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Bamby, how about you? What's pulled and or pushed you into leading?
Bueno, primero que nada, gracias a Dios por la vida, gracias a Dios por la tierra, gracias a Dios por la oportunidad de estar aquí, por la presencia de todas las personas que nos acompañan. I know that it was probably hard for some of you to understand what I just said, but I always honor my higher power, my creator, for giving me the opportunity to breathe one more day. I also honor the land where we're standing all, wherever we may be, and I also honor your beautiful presence, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. You know, what got me to where I am today, it has been my own personal experiences, but also, you know, being that I have survived incarceration, homelessness, sex work as means to survive, violence both in prison and the streets, sexual assaults, overdoses, drug addiction. You know, I think anything and everything that anyone can probably think of, I have survived it. But also because I had the opportunity and the privilege to reform my life, and I also felt that there was a responsibility. And so I have a responsibility to my people, seeing that even 20 years, I mean, back in the 80s when I started my transition at 18, the issues that I went through and are no different than the issues that young people are going through today who are transgender and non-conforming intersex people. And so just seeing that every day, it's sort of like what propels me to continue to do what has to be done nonstop. And even though I'm tired, I'm also hopeful, you know, to what needs to be done, and really also appreciate partnerships, right? Because the work cannot be done by ourselves. We need people who stand in solidarity with all of us for us to be able to do the work. And so that is what sort of like led me to be where I am today, but also understanding that there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Thanks so much, Bamby. Frances, I'll turn it over to you to ask the next question.
Each of you is connected to a program either you're participating in, you've designed, you give to others to help sustain and support people of color aspiring to be leaders or in leadership positions. And Bamby, just because you've already tempted us with your talk about yourself and appreciation for your desire to make sure people don't still have to go through what you had to go through. Can you talk about both the Sisterhood Trust, the type of support you've received, and the type of support internally you're giving to others?
Yes, I'm really grateful that you know, under the leadership of Connie from Southern California, Invest in Justice, that, you know, this cohort of leaders here in Los Angeles specifically, that we hope could be replicated and many other places, right? It's an opportunity for women who are leaders of color, particularly leaders of organizations and executive positions, to be able to decompress and to be able to just, even if it's just for one day, to forget about everything that is happening. And I know that it's super hard for many of us to find that moment and for us to find that time. But it's, in my experiences and for what I heard from my sisters, is that it is replenishing, right? It is, it feeds my soul and it feeds people's soul, right? It propels us to continue to do the work that still needs to happen. And I think one of the things that doesn't happen often is that that people really think about the investment that need to happen in people, right? For people to continue to do the work, right? We don't think of healthcare. I mean, yeah, self-care, right? Which is also healthcare, right? Because if we don't take care of our health through self-preservation and self-care, then we cannot continue to do this work. I think it's important to recognize that this work is very taxing in our bodies and our minds and our spirits, right? Especially with everything that is happening across the United States, right? Against communities of color and, the hate that is happening, the rhetoric that is happening, and how that all of that impacts our psyche, right? And when we find spaces for us to come together and share our challenges, our opportunities, our hopes, our visions, right? While at the same time, take care of our bodies and take care of our spirits. It's something that we really need to, I guess I'm gonna say, um, duplicate in other places. And I'm really grateful that um, that we were able to bring this cohort together again under the leadership of Connie um and my sister um from Coco. Anyways, yes.
Area,
Oh my God, how could I forget Aurea?
I
Yes.
know, but I knew you
I'm like,
knew.
I
I
have
knew you
her,
knew.
I have her face, and I'm like, please, please forgive
I
me.
knew you knew. So, Kavita, can I turn to you? And we might come back to you, Bamby, again. But Kavita, at this point, you've been participating in a program, and also Repower has its own program. So, can you tell us a little bit about both and the impact it's had on you and on the organization?
Absolutely. And I'm going to start with the Repower program, just building off of what Bamby just shared about the Sisterhood Trust, because we have a program internally at Repower, which we call the Women of Color Leadership Program, which is a similar setup. Was built out of this realization of the need for women of color leaders to have spaces that were built for them, that spoke to their needs, that folks could come together within that community and really not only meet the needs around skill building and professional leadership, but also their own personal leadership, their sustainability within this movement, their the things that they need to talk through with peers, like management struggles, things that come up for them along the way. So 2 years ago, we built out this program, which is a 3-month cohort. It meets once in person at the start of the cohort, then virtually for 12 weeks, then once again in person at the end of the cohort. We've been bringing together 30 to 35 leaders who identify as women of color over the last couple of years, and we run it twice a year. And the cohort just has amazing success. It's not only really speaks to some of the things that Bamby just spoke to around taking care of ourselves, understanding what we, you know, how we see ourselves as more than just the work, and how do we move through this work, recognizing that, but also in building the network that folks need. And I think as I was listening to Bamby speak, that was what was really resonating for me, was like, yes, we all need people that understand not only the work we do, but the position that we hold, especially when we are sitting in identities that are marginalized, you know, within our society, let alone within our organizations. And so having a network of women of color leaders that folks can really lean on and turn to has just been extremely beneficial. Our cohort participants are always sharing really wonderful things. If you happen to go to our Instagram page for Repower, there's like a great little video that we put up there a couple of weeks ago, sharing some of the great things folks had to say about participating in our cohort. And yeah, and it's really open to mid-level managers. So recognizing that there are some more supports for higher level executive directors and even the number twos, which I'll talk about in a second, but the middle level managers are sometimes not seen, especially in big organizations. So how can we develop supports for them to continue to pull them into leadership? But outside of Repower, I have the great pleasure of being a part of the Build the Bench cohort, which is sponsored by the Center of Innovation on Worker Organizations, which is called CIWO, and it's housed at Rutgers University. And this initiative was designed specifically to support the number twos in organizations. Again, realizing that, you know, when you become an ED, an executive director, you may suddenly have all these supports kind of presented to you, but what was existing for the folks that maybe are going to be the ones to take that next step. And so Build the Bench was really created out of that idea of how do we support these leaders before they have to step into leadership, or the highest sort of rung of leadership. And it's just been an amazing experience. It's been great to connect to other sort of number twos across the countries in similar organizations, folks who really understand the work, but also I think the position and the unique challenges that come from being both the manager of many, many people and also reporting up to an executive director, and like the position that the challenges that come with that position. So I'm really fortunate to be a part of that cohort, and Build the Bench has like an annual convening that brings folks together, but there's also these quarterly meetups where we have a chance to cover topics that feel the most resonant to us. And I know they just have some new people come on, so they're building out even more like programming for this cohort, which we're really excited about.
Great, thank you. And could you put in the chat the Instagram handle, because people have been asking for it. And Kelly, you run this program, you developed this program. Tell us more about the support that you give as the Black Nonprofit Chief Executives of Philadelphia came into being.
Yes, I'm one of the conveners of BNCEP, but what I want to start off with very briefly is when we speak about child and youth development, we often use the term or the reference, it takes a village. And we talk about how important it is for folks to have social connections and how it helps to shape and support individuals. And leadership development and leadership sustainability is no different. We need a village. So for Black nonprofit leaders in Philly, BNCEP is that village. BNCEP was founded in June 2020 in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and in the backdrop of COVID. At that first meeting, we had 24 people attended a virtual meeting. And it was clear, even at that time, and still today, that Black nonprofit leaders needed a space to connect, support each other, share together, and learn together. Today, 4 years later almost, BNCEP has over 260 members, many Black nonprofit EDs, CEOs, senior leaders, program directors are now members of BNCP. And in my role as Managing Director of Leadership Equity at the United Way, myself and my colleague, Felicity Dunbar, we do capacity building a little differently. We focus on building the community of Black leaders first and have those leaders inform us of what they need and want in professional development or training, even to matters around dosage, the delivery, the format, and how they want to be engaged and how they want to be supported. Traditional capacity building, and we've all been there, really identifies what they see as what you need and then create programming to shoehorn or squeeze you in based on what they think you need. And one of the things that I think is important, and both Bamby and Kavita mentioned it, is recognizing that social connections and relationship building are equally important as skill development and leadership enhancement. So the things that we provide BNCEP members are free executive coaching. Now, many of you out there know, unfortunately, it has a bad connotation because people get executive coaching when they're about to get terminated. This executive coaching is when the leader says, I need a coach around specific areas that I feel are important. I need a thought partner. I need someone to help guide me through this challenge. That executive coaching is critical. We provide frequent leadership and management workshops. We provide finance academies. We have programming for emerging leaders aspiring to be CEOs or EDs. We've conducted evaluation workshops. Even just last week, as a matter of fact, the ladies of BNCP conducted a Healing and a Thriving event for Black women nonprofit leaders, and that had about 100 attendees. We convene CEO roundtables, which are, because we have a large group, we create a smaller, safe space for leaders to candidly discuss issues that are of importance to them. We create opportunities for Black nonprofit leaders to connect with regional funders. We offer frequent opportunities to make connections among peers because that's important too, to facilitate and foster those connections among each other. One of the things we did last November was we provided the first overnight wellness retreat for 50 Black nonprofit leaders from Philadelphia. That hadn't been done before. And I can say when we do these types of things, it sends a message to regional philanthropy around what is important. And then they have been very responsive as well. We convene general body meetings where we present information on a variety of different issues of importance. The January meeting, we talked about accessing state and federal funding that isn't reimbursable, because in Philadelphia, if you have a contract with the city of Philadelphia, it's on a reimbursable basis, but we needed to share information to our members on how they can access state and federal funding that is not on a reimbursable basis. We advocate for equitable funding, and essentially we serve as a connector to resources because we realize we can't be everything to everyone. Now, all of these programs are designed to support, nurture, and promote Black nonprofit leadership. And the benefits to building the community first is that you never have to recruit or market the program. We have a community that is prepared to take advantage of what's being offered. So we invest that time that would be typically spent recruiting in customizing the program to meet the needs of our members. So we send out a notice on an upcoming program, and within 24 hours, there's a registration. Registration is completed. So that's a little bit about BNCP. Thank you.
Thanks so
Thanks
much,
so
Kelly.
much. And Sean,
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually going to go off script a little bit because we were going to pivot to asking a question to each of you about what can the sector do to support programs. And I'm mindful that we are getting some questions in the Q&A, there was a question about power structures that we end up replicating as people of color that fortunately Kavita did weigh in on. We also got a question that was about fundings, and one of the main issues for leaders of color being the difficulty accessing resources. And so just wanted to sort of maybe pose both of those questions to our panelists and see which one you want to respond to. So Kavita, since you sort of already started weighing in on the question about replicating structures, wonder if there's anything more that you wanted to say beyond what you put into the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Zara, for asking this question. And I think I just want to really lift it up in case folks didn't see it, of just this sense of how do we do this work? How do we support BIPOC leaders? And also recognize that sometimes it's our BIPOC leaders who are creating harm or causing lateral harm, or, you know, the idea that I think there's generally an idea of when we place a BIPOC person in leadership that the harm should be mitigated just by the sheer fact of their representation. And the reality is that, you know, that's not true, that we all are still very much like swimming in the waters of all the things that exist around us. And that I think really it comes back to this idea of like competition, scarcity, individualism, which has been really ingrained in all of us for so many years. And so, you know, I think a lot about how much work on learning political education that it's really going to take for all of us to get to the place where we can figure out how not to be harming one another as we sort of ascend into leadership. And that idea too of like ascension and political positional power and hierarchy, all of those things are coming into question right now. I know even within our own my own organization, there's so much talk about that. And so just recognizing that we at this current moment are tasked with a lot of different holding a lot of different conversations, both around like what is happening external to our organization, what we see is what we're fighting and what we're hoping to make an impact on, and also how that then shows up within our own organization. And that we as people of color, it doesn't mean that we just inherently know the answer or know the way as to how to fix that. And so you know, figuring out how to lead transparently, but also sort of develop the support of the organization and of other leaders to try to move us toward more like community and collective action and abundance, which is not an easy task by any means.
Thanks so much. And Kelly, bringing it back to you, given you started talking a little bit about directing resources to Black leaders, somewhat about finances, somewhat about just like the sort of supports that people are needing. Do you have any thoughts either about the question about how people of color replicate problematic sort of structures, and or the question about what is the role of funders in sort of incentivizing that kind of competition that Kavita was talking about? Curious what your take is on either or both of those.
Yeah, I think oftentimes we make the assumption that because individuals are people of color, that they're not, that they're anti-racist. And that's something that you can't necessarily assume. There have been cases where we've seen that. I think one of the things that we try to do from a tactical point within BNCEP is really put the emphasis on building relationships as opposed to being transactional. The sector that we're in is 100% transactional. And if we don't have any use to them, then we are dispensed. And the thing that we have to begin to do is recognize that we bring our full selves to the work and deal with each other in a relationship, in a supportive way that builds relationships and really help to change the sector. As it pertains to philanthropy, that's an issue that has been difficult for a long time. But I will say you have two different issues. The staff at many foundations tend to be, in some cases, on the same page. It's the boards of the foundation where the work has to be done. And that's where the emphasis has to be made. And I think, to be perfectly honest with you, we have to really challenge, and when we talk about this whole reckoning from 2020 and the rollback we've seen, whether it's the University of Texas and things in Texas and in Florida, we have to challenge philanthropy to live up to those DEI statements that they made several years ago. And we have to challenge them to show the measurable impacts of the good things that happen when they prioritize BIPOC-led nonprofit organizations. We can't allow folks to get off the hook. We also have to start lifting up our own stories around what happened and why, when folks started to prioritize equity, how organizations survived and how some organizations were able to do some good work and in some cases thrive for a little bit of time. So I think it's not one answer. It's a very complicated question, but that's one of the things that I would just say. Focus on trying to deal with the boards, challenge philanthropy to lift up and live up rather to those high, lofty DEI statements, and have them lift up the good work that was done when they prioritize equity. That's a story that has to be told, and it hasn't been.
Thanks so much, Kelly. And Bamby, want to now move towards wrapping up with you. Curious what your vantage point is on these questions about both philanthropy, because we know that the investment in organizations, LGBTQ organizations generally, but particularly trans organizations, has been lacking for years. But also, like, how do you think about this question that's raised around, the ways that we replicate hierarchies, whether it's on the basis of like our leadership as people of color or within our queer community and spaces as well? I'm just curious how you what you would say about all of this. I'm sure
I do have a lot to say, actually. No, but the truth is that unfortunately, the way the system is created, right? Like, we have to fall into what has already been created, right? Like this hierarchy, right? That a lot of times we don't have a choice, right? Obviously there are other models resurfacing, but I think what we can do when we are in this positions of leadership, right? I can put our organization as an example, right? We do have a board, but all of our board are trans women who are Latinas, who some are monolingual speakers, who we don't ask to raise money for us, right? Like for the organization, right? So essentially, we don't have a typical model of a nonprofit because, again, most nonprofits, you have, you ask like a give or get amount of money or fundraise or whatever it is, right? We don't have that model. In addition to that, we are adopting policies, right, to really value people and support people, right? And for people to really understand that the work that they're doing is important and that we care about their sustainability, right? Some of the things that we have implemented, for instance, is, all of our employees get a sabbatical, right? Not just executives, but all of our employees, right? Another thing is that we have included is free healthcare for all of our employees, right? And I posted in the chat a report that is called All the Respect, right? Like on how to really, how do we support or how other organizations are supporting organizers, right? And so I think we have to live to what we believe in, right? And put that into practice, right? A lot of times we use language, right? and we use terms of, you know, like social justice or transformative justice and, you know, healing justice, but what do we actually do about that? Right. And so I think that is something that we need to really reconcile ourselves with and really think about how we can make all of those things happen. Right. Obviously, valuing people who are doing the most hard work that one can possibly think. And I'm thinking of people like myself, right? Like people who are trans, who are case managers and who are uh, often living their own experiences, right, of violence, and when they interview people and stuff like that. And so, you know, what do we do to protect our people, right? You know, we do provide mental health services and coaching, and you know, I believe in leadership development, and I know that I'm not going to be here forever, right? And so, how do we prepare the pipeline, right? Not just within our organization, but overall. And I know that we as an organization are doing that. We're contributing to building the infrastructure of the broader trans movement, right? And that includes making sure that we start with our own organization. But I think
Thanks so
also
much.
we all have a responsibility, right? Like philanthropy, all of us in whatever way possible, we need to use our privilege and our power to open opportunities for all the people who may not have access.
So much, Bamby. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Kavita. I really appreciated this conversation. Thanks to all of you for joining this webinar. As we said at the beginning, you'll get a follow-up email with the recording and other information about the conversation that we had today. You'll reach out to the panelists, learn more about the programs that and their organizations, and build programs like these in other parts of the country as well. So thanks everybody for being with us, and hope you have a good rest of the day.